When I normally do these talks, or in the past, I would often read a narrative that someone had shared with me and let them speak directly to you of the terror and torture they have endured. And oftentimes I've found that the audience is in such shock that the next 20 minutes of what I say doesn't really get through, and it's understandable. And in encountering that ruination and human suffering more than 1,000 times, I've often wondered, what's the point of what I'm doing? There is darkness in people's hearts, and greed, and corruption, and systems that promote suffering. And who am I, and what am I ever going to do? What are any of us going to do?
Good evening. Thank you for that response. I'm J. Laurent Latore, the director of the Center for African and African American Research. The Center for African and African American Research assembled here some of the world's leading scholars, policymakers, and activists to discuss human traffic, past and present.
The world is becoming more and more complicated, or perhaps our tools are now recognizing its complication. And you need more than one type of analysis to really grasp the wholeness of a particular phenomenon.
We have a lot of great historians of Africa and people who study the African past that brought millions of people to the Americas to grow sugar and cotton and essentially fund the Industrial Revolution. And we have another dozen students of the contemporary period.
I called myself a social scientist. I was trained as a historical sociologist. My method is historical but interdisciplinary. So I like to marry the psychological with the economic and with the sociological, cultural, and so on. I hope that we can have a broad set of discussions that could arrive eventually at some more profound understanding of this phenomenon called human trafficking.
Okay, so what I'm doing now, we're just getting ready to hang the large paintings. So yeah, I was born in Jamaica. My family moved to Canada, the East Coast, when I was quite young. And I live now in Victoria, BC, on the west coast of Canada. So the paintings, it's a triptych called Bagasse, and it's an image of a field of sugarcane after it's been cut down. It's just kind of indicative of that sort of brutality of economic systems that kind of leave everything else as waste other than what they want to harvest.
Scholars can talk out an idea and examine its context, but artists know how to make people feel it and give an image to something.
I see it obviously as a reference to the sort of sugar economy, and a lot of my work will reference slavery, and then on another level it's kind of this beautiful pattern which is sort of has this sort of disturbing narrative underlying it, but then visually there's a seduction and a beauty to it. I moved back to Jamaica right after my undergraduate degree and started as a practicing artist there, and it's those experiences that have really kind of been essential to underpinning my work. The spheres, I kind of almost see them as these objects that kind of emerge out of the field of sugarcane. There's 5 of them in the exhibition. This one here is a slave canoe. And so it would be the boat that would take people from the African coast to the slave ships. This one's fairly straightforward. This is actually the first dome I did. It's shows an open slave shackle. Other images, like the images of the birds and stuff, are a little bit, migratory birds. They usually all go in one direction. This one, they're all kind of going all different contradictory directions. And so I kind of see that as kind of just talking about these movements of people.
There's a global context to these phenomena. Today's situation is one in which transportation is much, much easier than it was before. People can move great distances. And because nations are in communication with each other, it's clear to all that there are some tremendously wealthy nations and some very poor nations. So there's a flow of people from poor nations to wealthier nations where they can work and earn a living and remit money that will allow their families to survive.
Well, I'm a lawyer, so I use the international legal definition, which has three key elements. One is that it includes some form of action like movement, recruiting, transport, harboring of a person. Secondly, it includes exploitations. And thirdly, it includes some element of lack of freedom, coercion, oppression. Trafficking is part of a whole continuum of situations that go from relatively free to relatively forced migration. So a whole range of different situations fit within that scope.
I've been an activist for a long time. I guess if I had to sort of boil it down, the way I think of it is it's the commodification of people, the selling of people. So it's partly the selling of people, it's also the disposability of people as people are moved across borders. It's being sold and also deprived of certain communities of support and rights that would allow them to have a voice, that would allow them to protest, that would allow them to quit a job if they didn't like it.
That site there of those buildings crumbling and some completely destroyed repeatedly.
Sometimes there's an environmental disaster someplace, like an earthquake in Haiti, that drives people to flee to other regions of Haiti or to the Dominican Republic, or there are droughts in a particular region, so people can't make a living by farming, so they have to seek employment elsewhere.
In a very private way, you know, people are sitting down at tables like these, maybe not tables like these exactly, but making the decision in a domestic space to leave, to do something, to take a risk, you know. Someone is promising them jobs, somebody's trying to, you know, hoodwink them into doing something, and they're going to take the chance because they're sort of figuring out, if I do that, I may do that for a few years and then I'll be free to do something else. So, you know, it's all people are trying to calculate and to calibrate their lives that are terribly unhomely for whatever reason.
Those are John Crows, which is a Jamaican vulture. And so again, kind of alluding to this sort of, you know, systems of waste and who picks up the waste, and also, but then these sort of images of flight, which kind of imply freedom. Seeing a John Crow soar is actually kind of beautiful. It's the way it just sort of sits there aloft to the currents and floats around. So I'm trying to get, I guess, the kind of complexity of all these human relationships that are involved in the system of human traffic.
You know, we used to call this slave trading, which was a much more precise term. It's a very strong term.
To discuss this growing global industry, we're joined by Siddharth Kara, the author of a new book called Sex Trafficking Inside the Business of Modern Slavery.
I've volunteered in this Bosnian refugee camp for one summer and heard a lot of terrible stories of Serbian soldiers who would traffic in Bosnian women and girls after going into villages and typically executing the men. I had a background in economics, finance, law, and I thought, well, maybe my background is suited to understanding this phenomenon. So I left my career and began what's now 11 years of research around the world, almost entirely self-financed, trying to understand servitude and trafficking and exploitation. How does it work? What are the mechanics of it, the business model? And based on that analysis, make some arguments of what can be done. Slave owner demand to maximize profit. For almost any business throughout history, labor has been one of the highest cost component for that business. So throughout history, producers have tried to find a way to minimize or eliminate labor costs. Slavery is the extreme of this. Slavery today, as it has been across time, remains an economic crime. It's of course a human rights violation and many other awful things, but it's fundamentally an economic crime. It's about maximizing profit by minimizing or eliminating the cost of labor.
Businesses want to seek the cheapest labor they can find. That's the bottom line.
In the old context, you largely exploited slaves in agricultural labor, plantation work, maybe some domestic servitude as well. Today, trafficking victims and slaves are exploited in dozens of industries, from agriculture, of course, to construction, mining, and commercial sex, which is by far the most profitable of all.
The issue of modern-day slavery is probably one of the greatest challenges domestically to human rights in the United States. It's so entrenched in our own society that you don't have to go far to find examples of just horrendous treatment of people. And so you're compelled to do something about it. Textile is often the classic example of abuse in old industry, et cetera, although it's not so old anymore, it's using modern machines. So very cheap production of the material abroad in virtually minimalist conditions are linked to eventual very high retail stores, dress shops, etc., in the United States. In the middle there, in the United States, there are small firms that do specialty work, the needlework, the correction work, those kinds of things. And that's a lot of that is done in sweatshops, right in your backyard. So as an average American, there could be a sweatshop right down the street in your neighborhood in a modern Los Angeles suburb, and we don't even know about it.
And then a fresh embarrassment. Workers in a New York sweatshop charged that they'd been shortchanged making the very same line of Kathy Lee clothing.
We find startling things. The case I mentioned in my presentation, 74 women from Thailand captured, enslaved for 4 years behind barbed wire walls. This is downtown suburban Los Angeles, middle America, and no one knew about it, even though there was barbed wire all around the walls, etc. What they were making was being sold in the equivalent of stores like JCPenney's and Macy's and those. So we consume, as average Americans, we consume the product of this coerced labor. They live right in our backyard often, and we're impervious to it.
Good. I'll take everything!
At Tesco, we buy in large quantities to keep our prices low for you. The price cut
People
is
like
low.
us have benefited enormously by human trafficking. For example, food in the United States is very inexpensive, partly because migrant labor that is paid unfairly, that works under unsafe circumstances, exposed to terrible pesticides, is working on farms. In North Carolina, in neighboring counties.
Roughly 1 in 57 shrimp in the world can be traced back to some form of what we call trafficking or slave labor exploitation in Bangladesh. Either the child labor, the debt bondage, or the forced labor, which is happening in the processors. Roughly 7 in 10 of the shrimp, baby shrimp that are gathered, is done through child labor. The next step is the shrimp processing. And this is done by highly capitalized companies in the towns of Khulna, Shatkhira, and Dhaka. This is the beheading, the descaling, the deveining, the defooting of the shrimp, and then ultimately freezing it, as you see there, where it's shipped primarily to the US, 26%, 42% to the EU, and most of the rest to Japan. So 1 in 57. And you might say, well, that doesn't sound so much. The average American consumes roughly 2 kilograms of shrimp a year. Depending on the kind of shrimp, that's between 60 and 200 pieces. So each of us eats 1 to 3 pieces of shrimp that is tainted by slave-like exploitation in Bangladesh. Now, when you start adding China and other countries, Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, that ratio of 1 to 57 will probably shrink.
The fact that South Asian workers are working in Saudi Arabia, subsidizing the Saudi economy, in effect lowers our oil prices a bit.
Electronics. So chip makers abroad are some of the worst paid. Those chips are now, the chips themselves are so cheap that you basically can't pay anybody anything to produce them and still make money in the global market.
If you own your own iPhone or iPad, do you ever stop for a moment and think, who makes this thing?
Anybody can produce the chips, anywhere. It jumps around. It starts in one country, and then workers start to organize and put upward pressure on wages, and then the companies will pick up and move to another low-wage country, always driving the price of labor down because they really can't make a profit if that labor isn't so cheap. But those components that they make go into very high-tech, very high-profit equipment, our laptops, our computers, What we're doing is we're making the workers at the lowest end pay the most, while the high end consumes and gets high profits.
The further issue, of course, is that consumers sometimes are unaware of the conditions under which the food we buy, the clothes we wear, the shoes we put on were manufactured. Sometimes they were manufactured by people who did not have the right to leave their workplace, who were not fairly compensated for their labor, who were placed in unhealthy situations.
Criminals like you, like me, are rational economic thinkers and actors. And so they have this opportunity to generate immense profits at very low cost and risk, because we don't effectively intervene. And as long as that reality persists, human trafficking will persist and continue to grow.
All of us are implicated. All of us are implicated. Businesses compete to give us the best product for the lowest price, and they often seek sources of labor that enable them to lower prices.
President Clinton, with great fanfare, signed legislation putting the North American Free Trade Agreement into law.
We've seen a whole move toward, free trade in neoliberalism, right? Removing trade barriers for the movement of goods and services. And at the same time that's happened, that the world is dropping its trade barriers, we're throwing up borders to prevent the movement of workers. Of course, workers are still moving, right? There's still, if you took all the migrant laborers around the world and the 6 people on average that they support, and you put them all in one place, you'd have the 3rd biggest nation in the world. But they're moving because they're often either crossing borders without authorization, or they're moving under these guest worker programs that limit their access to social benefits.
I am an H2 worker.
There are complex additional issues, that is, the policies of nation states. What rights of the workers will the nation state protect? Which workers get protected and which workers don't get protected?
There are disturbing allegations about the country's guest worker system that exists now. Corporate America says they need more guest workers, but now critics say the system that they have is exploiting foreign workers.
If you have guest worker programs that aren't abusive, I mean, even if you don't have people locked into storage sheds, as we've seen, or not paid for their work or underpaid, even if everybody, if the employers always abided by the rules, and we can only hope that most of them do, you're still creating a labor system that creates a class of workers, right? Essentially a caste of people who will never be integrated into the polity, who can't go to school, whose children can't come with them and go to school, who don't have access to Social Security or any other social benefits, who are sort of outside the polity. And essentially what you get is a sort of apartheid system.
In the United States, in the rural South, African American workers were long exploited and undercompensated, a legacy of slavery. But during the 1940s, when African American workers were demanding more rights, and finally when in 1942 the Justice Department stood up for the rights of African American workers in Florida, that was a time when Southern farm owners were able to secure a guest worker program that would bring in foreign workers in order to replace them. Forms of exploitation that were racialized African American became Latino in the United States.
And I'll turn briefly to a kind of interesting parallel of the movie Taken. Here, if you've seen the movie, it stars Liam Neeson, in which it features his teenage daughter goes on a trip to Paris with her best friend. They are taken by an Albanian gang, sold into slavery, and then in 48 hours, Liam Neeson goes to work and tries to find, and manages somehow to find and liberate his daughter.
Oh my God, they got Amanda!
It's a story about virginity and his desire to protect it. And along the way, Liam kills, I think 27, maybe it's more, Muslim men, all of them traffickers.
If you let my daughter go now, that'll be the end of it.
No.
But if you don't, I will look for you.
Where is she?
I will find you. I will kill you.
He actually gets the trafficker on the phone. He managed to find the phone number. He says, I don't know who you are, but if you don't let my daughter go, I will find I will find you, I will kill you. And then the great sort of satisfying moment in the movie is when he actually does kill that baby trafficker. And you hear every crunch and bone breaking inside. It is tremendously violent. Somehow, Liam Neeson managed to get the bullet just to the right of his daughter's ear and kills the last bad guy, liberates his, and she goes, "Daddy, he found me."
Bad man versus, victim versus evil man, usually man, and disproportionate number, say, of trafficked women.
This is the ultimate raid and rescue story.
All of the light is going on, the bare elements of it, the more visible element or the more sensational element.
So you take human trafficking, which is primarily 95% not about sex, workers doing all kinds of menial tasks, but the focus gets immediately on sex. So the stories about sex trafficking trump everything else.
It is absolutely, and I think incontrovertibly the case, that the gross numbers of individuals exploited in sex trafficking around the world are minor compared to all the other modes in which individuals are exploited in slave-like conditions. As I mentioned, by my calculation, only about 4%.
And then the question is, well, how do you intervene successfully? Well, you raid a brothel and you close it down, and then you've liberated everybody and everyone feels good and you go home. Whereas the conditions that brought people to the brothel haven't changed. And more often than not, I think the numbers are 46% of rescued sex workers end up back in the brothel.
Trafficking is seen as being the product of a sort of victim oppressor dyad, that there's an oppressor who goes out there, kidnaps, tricks, somehow captures a young person and puts them in a situation where they're brutalized and exploited. And what's left out of that, which I think is important, is that very often the young person is looking for an opportunity to escape, is looking for an exit from a dead-end situation of unemployment, of family violence, of poverty. And so the possibility of moving, particularly moving across the border, is very attractive.
There's an element there of agency of the women who are being trafficked that's just getting elided in this discussion.
তবে এখন আমরা 10 বছর থেকে যেটা আমরা দেখতে পাচ্ছি যে নিজেরাও আসলে অনেক মেয়েই আছে, কিন্তু যদি বলেন যে আগে যাদেরকে নিয়ে এসেছে তারা কি এখন চলে যেতে চায়, কিন্তু আমাকেও নিয়ে এসেছে কিন্তু আমি এখন চলে যেতে চাই না। কেন চাই না?
Many of them, for a number of reasons, want to come to the red light area. I remember during the shooting one day, and I had a headache, and I was lying down in one of the rooms, and there was a young girl, very young, next to me, and I started chatting with her, and turns out that she's one of the people who is underage and TMSC has picked her up. And I said, you must be really happy, you can go back to your mother and all. And she said, no, my mother doesn't look after me. And all my middle-class romantic notions of mother and, I mean, you saw my attachment with the mother was writ large on the film. And I was like, for me, it was a huge shock, but that's the reality.
One of the concerns I have about it is the quick leap to calling it slavery. And there's no question that the coercion is profound. There's that one of the slides in one of the presentations earlier today said had the Immokalee, Florida tomato pickers who are saying, "I'm not a slave," and that statement right there captures a lot of that. It's like that is what people are resisting, is disposability, even if they are being disposed of by whomever, employers, by states.
Well, I have become increasingly circumspect in the last few years about using the term slavery, and primarily that's driven by the fact that I think the term has been used more and more recklessly by many in the field, or sensationalistically.
If we see a person purely as a victim, we require that person to be perfect. We have to insist that they had no choice in the matter in order to come to help them. But imagine yourself in that situation.
Let me say that the hunt for the perfect victim is almost worldwide. And people want innocent victims. And therefore, one of the things you constantly see is this distinction between nice trafficked victim and the nasty economic migrant. And this comes up in Thailand, it comes up in China, it comes up certainly in Europe. For people who are truly victimized and should be covered under our law, a number of U.S. attorneys only wanted to take the good cases. They didn't want to take the non-good cases.
If we cast people fully as victims, we deny people who have taken a risk and people who have done things not quite officially the same human rights to protection that all people deserve.
So that just because someone, say, signed up and knowingly came to some place to go into sex work, that didn't mean that they necessarily signed up for 36 clients a day.
So there's a kind of slippage between the rhetoric of fighting slavery and the actual efficacy of people's interventions. If you look at the contemporary anti-trafficking movement, it combines a really interesting coalition of people from the far right, religious conservatives, who are trying to rescue prostitutes, to good liberals and left activists who are struggling against capitalism. Right? That's probably where I fit. It is feels necessary and important to kind of unmask some of the hypocrisy. And unfortunately, that gets you into trouble sometimes, because some of that hypocrisy extends to the well-meaning, good people who claim to be rescuing the slaves, but in fact are not necessarily.
An informed consumer can be an advocate.
Diamonds, timeless, beautiful, symbols of love. But in Africa during the 1990s, these beautiful stones became blood diamonds, named not for their color, but for their cost in human conflict and suffering.
I think that was actually a somewhat successful consumer campaign. Once it came to the attention of consumers that the diamonds they may be purchasing and proposing to their beloved with had been mined in conditions of warfare and bloodshed, they didn't like that idea, and there was a consumer outcry and a certification process to say this is not a blood diamond. This supply chain work is very, very important if you're going to move policy and argue for the kinds of resources and tactics that have to be deployed to certify and trace the chain and make sure it's clear of this type of exploitation.
Clearly, eliminating the ability to generate immense profits through forced labor is something that our laws and interventions and tactics should be focused on. But then also elevating consumer awareness around these issues, that the products that we consume far down the supply chain on the other side of the world may be tainted by child labor, forced labor, or human trafficking of some kind. And by and large, I think most consumers wouldn't like that if they knew about it.
My approach is to put more emphasis on the human rights of the people who are trafficked. So my emphasis is to say what we need to do is to ensure that people who are at risk or who are in vulnerable situations are freed, are able to leave situations they want to leave, are able to get paid for work they're doing, are able to call the police if they're being brutalized, are able to have a nationality. Those are the things which are the most important for me in addressing the problem.
I can envision a time when we'll have the ability to move across borders and work in places, and that allows you to focus on labor rights and the treatment of workers instead of worrying about what kind of passport or visa they're holding, right? Whereas the AFL-CIO now puts it, we can worry about union cards instead of green cards.
I guess the other thing about the balls, going back to how they're put together, they kind of pack up into these little boxes, you know, about this big. It's like a neat little commodity almost, and it kind of becomes this kind of bigger thing of ideas. That was kind of exciting for me when I first sort of worked out the whole kind of shape and form and how they would all intertwine together. And I sort of saw some relation with the phenomenon of, you know, human migration and how people kind of arrive in a country and kind of unpack themselves and become something unexpected.
Scholars of slavery will certainly know that the first abolitionist movement was born in London in 1787 when 12 gentlemen got together at a printing shop and decided to make it their mission to abolish slavery in the British Empire. Today, with our powers to move and travel and gather data and evidence and communicate and organize, we've seen it in the Arab Spring and other parts of the world, the ability to communicate is so powerful. And I genuinely believe 8, 10, 12 of you, men and women, could find a way to come together and finish this work that started some centuries ago under much more difficult circumstances. So I draw hope from that narrative as well.
I wish I had the solutions. It's actually very nice to see the university take on, in this program, to take on the responsibility and engagement to have this conversation.
I think it went wonderfully. An excellent conference. We assembled, or Michaeline especially, assembled just an unparalleled group of scholars, activists, policymakers, and artists who were really concerned to address the issue of human trafficking.
The Center for African and African American Research seeks to engage all senses in thinking profoundly about vital questions regarding human being in the world, particularly the more vulnerable beings. Consider the way in which this crop, sugarcane, was introduced into the so-called New World, the bitter sweetness of its production, the way that facilitated the crushing of so many bodies, disposable bodies, and like bagasse considered detritus, but not quite, born again, creolized, if you will.
I am a H2 worker, coming from the island of Jamaica. I am a H2 worker, cutting cane in a Florida, working so hard in the burning sun, wondering if slavery really done. I'm working on your cane field still, working for your meager dollar bill. So don't bite the hands that feed you. I have dreams like you do. Don't treat me like I'm a slave here. Just give me a wage that is fair. I'm working on your cane field still. Working for your meager dollar bill.